You didn't say anything wrong. You didn't raise your voice. You weren't even paying attention to them, and somehow they walked away calling you intimidating. You know that feeling? When someone tells you you're hard to read, and you're sitting there thinking, I wasn't even trying to be. That's not a coincidence. That's not a personality flaw. That's what happens when an INTP walks into a room. Most people go quiet when they have nothing to say. You go quiet when you're thinking the hardest. I think that's the part nobody explains. For most people, silence is a pause, a gap between words. But for an INTP, silence is where all the real work happens. You're running scenarios, questioning assumptions, connecting things that haven't been connected yet. The problem? Nobody can see that from the outside. From the outside, you look like someone who's decided something and hasn't told them what yet. That is terrifying to people who are used to reading faces, reading tone, reading energy. You give them none of that. And when someone can't read you, their brain does exactly what it was built to do. It assumes threat. You're not withholding, you're processing. But here's the thing to them, it looks exactly the same. Studies on social silence show that people begin constructing negative assumptions about someone after just 4 seconds of unexpected quiet during conversation. 4 seconds. You haven't even finished your thought, and the worst part, the deeper you're thinking, the more unsettling you seem. You know what most people do when something upsets them? They show it immediately. Because visible emotion signals predictability. It says, I'm readable, I'm safe, I'm one of you. You don't do that, not because you don't feel things. I think most INTPs actually feel things quite intensely. They just don't see the point of putting it on display before they've processed it. So when someone says something that should bother you, you pause, you consider it. You respond from the part of your brain that thinks, not the part that reacts. To you, that's just being reasonable. To them, it looks like you're completely unmoved, like they didn't land, like you're somewhere above it all, watching them from a distance. Emotional control reads as power. And most people aren't comfortable being around power they didn't invite. There's a consistent pattern therapists who work with introvert-extrovert conflicts have documented. The introvert stays analytical, the other person escalates, and the introvert's composure gets read as contempt. Not indifference. Contempt. That's how far off the interpretation goes. You weren't cold. You were calibrated. But calibration, to someone expecting heat, looks like ice. Here's something almost nobody talks about. When most people appear to listen, they're actually waiting. Waiting for a pause, a breath, an opening so they can say the thing they've already decided to say. You don't do that either. You actually absorb what someone is saying. You notice the word they chose over a different word. You catch the thing they said carefully versus the thing that slipped out. You're building a model of them in real time, and you're not even doing it on purpose. Dr. Jennifer Kahnweiler, who spent years researching introverted leadership, described this as one of the most underestimated social abilities that exists: the capacity to deeply observe without needing to dominate the space. But here's what nobody warned you about. People can feel when they're being genuinely observed, and it makes most of them deeply uncomfortable, because we're wired at a biological level to sense close attention and interpret it as scrutiny. So even when you're just curious, genuinely, neutrally curious, the other person feels like they're being assessed. They call you intense. What they mean is, you saw something I wasn't ready to show. Small talk is a social contract. The terms are simple: you don't go deep, you don't go real, you stay on the surface where it's warm and nobody gets exposed. It's not about connection. It's about signaling that you're safe to be around. You break that contract constantly, not to be provocative. Your mind just doesn't see the point of hovering at the surface when there's something more interesting underneath. So you ask one question, one real question, and suddenly the entire conversation shifts. Their energy changes. Their answer gets careful. And later, they describe you to someone else as a lot. You were just curious. I think this is one of the most misunderstood things about INTPs. Specifically, your questions aren't interrogations. They're invitations. But to someone who wasn't prepared to go there, an invitation to depth feels exactly like a spotlight. Research on introvert cognition shows that INTPs and similar types process incoming information through longer, more complex neural pathways before responding. What reads as hesitation from the outside is actually integration. You're taking in more before you say anything. And when that shows up as a question that cuts past the expected, the other person doesn't feel curious. They feel seen before they were ready to be seen. That is an uncomfortable feeling, even if nothing threatening was intended. You know what people pick up on almost immediately? Whether or not their approval matters to you? INTPs have internal standards, rigorous ones. Not for other people, mostly for ideas, for logic, for whether something actually holds up under scrutiny. But those standards leave a signature. a kind of quiet discernment that other people can sense. You're not judging them, but something in how you carry yourself suggests you have the capacity to, and that alone changes how people behave around you. Psychologist Ina Marcos Mendoza found that strong internal values worn naturally without apology, without broadcasting register to others as a kind of authority. Not aggression, not arrogance, just the presence of someone who has decided what they value and doesn't need external confirmation for it. To people who've never had to earn someone's intellectual respect, that reads as dismissal, but here's what it actually is: discernment. The quiet confidence of someone who knows what they're looking for and won't pretend to find it where it isn't. And most people, if they're honest with themselves, can feel the difference between someone who respects them and someone who's just tolerating them. INTPs are terrible at faking the former when they're experiencing the latter. Most people need conversations to end neatly, tension resolved, agreement reached, or at the very least acknowledgement exchanged. You can walk away from a disagreement while it's still unresolved and feel absolutely fine about it, not because you don't care, you care deeply, but your brain is comfortable holding open questions, sitting with ambiguity while the thinking continues. You don't need the emotional closing ritual to feel okay. To someone who does need that closure, watching you walk away unbothered is genuinely disorienting. It signals that you're operating by rules they don't have access to. I think this is actually one of the most distinctly INTP things on this entire list. Most personality types are wired for resolution. Conflict, then repair. Tension, then release. You're comfortable leaving something open, because to you, it's still being processed, it's not abandoned. But from the other side of that, it looks like you don't need them. And there are very few things more unsettling than meeting someone who genuinely doesn't need you. This is the one that cuts deepest. And I think most INTPs won't even recognize it about themselves at first. Most people spend enormous energy managing their image, correcting misperceptions, explaining themselves before they're asked, making sure people have the right idea about who they are. You don't, not because you don't care what people think, but because you've quietly, maybe unconsciously, made a decision that you'd rather be genuinely yourself and misread than perform a version of yourself just to be more palatable. That is not a small thing. That is one of the rarest traits there is, and most people have never encountered it before. Clinical researcher Carla Marie Manley found that the people others find most difficult to categorize are almost always the ones who stop needing external validation to feel stable. And that stability, that groundedness, triggers something specific in people who depend on social approval to feel okay. It's not that they dislike you, it's that you expose, without doing anything, the fragility of the system they've been living by. You're not trying to unsettle anyone. You're just not performing. But in a room full of people who are that alone, makes you stand out in a way that's very hard to ignore. You know what happens when an INTP is in a meeting, a class, a conversation, anywhere a flawed argument is being made? They don't just notice the flaw, they feel it. Like a splinter they can't stop touching. Most people, even if they notice, will stay quiet. Social cost is too high. Better to nod, let it pass, move on. You don't always have that filter, not because you want to embarrass anyone, but because your mind genuinely cannot move forward while something broken is sitting there uncorrected. So you say something, calmly, logically, without venom, and somehow that's the thing that lands hardest. Because there's nothing more exposing than someone pointing out your error without cruelty. Cruelty you can dismiss. Logic delivered without ego, that's much harder to deflect. People call it arrogance. What it actually is an almost allergic reaction to intellectual dishonesty. You're not trying to win, you're trying to think correctly. But to someone whose argument just got quietly dismantled, the distinction doesn't matter much. Here's the one that ties everything together. Almost every social dynamic that exists runs on an invisible exchange. I validate you. You validate me. Approval becomes currency, and whoever can give it or withhold it holds quiet power over everyone who wants it. INTPs don't play that game, not as a strategy, not to be difficult. You just don't need it. You can be in a room, be disliked, be misread, and return home and feel entirely okay. Your internal world is rich enough that it doesn't require external confirmation to stay stable. To someone whose sense of self is built on social feedback, that is one of the most threatening things they will ever encounter. Not because you've done anything, because you simply demonstrated that the thing they most depend on means almost nothing to you. Clinical work consistently shows that the people we find most intimidating are almost never the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most powerful in any traditional sense. They're the ones who expose our insecurities by existing unbothered. The ones who show us what we'd look like if we stopped needing permission. You're not cold, you're not superior, you didn't do anything wrong, you're just an INTP, and in a world where almost everyone is performing for an audience, the person who clearly isn't draws every eye in the room. I think the reason this keeps happening, the reason people keep calling you intimidating when you weren't trying to be anything, is simple. Most people have never met someone who is genuinely, quietly whole on their own, not pretending to be, not coping, not filling space with noise to hide from themselves, just present, thinking, observing, not needing anything from the room. You know what they say, watch out for the quiet ones. Most people say it like a warning. Maybe it's just the truth. The people who found you intimidating weren't responding to a threat. They were responding to a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw reflected back. The right people will figure that out, and they'll stay anyway. And if you know an INTP who spent years being told they're too much, send them this. Sometimes hearing it named out loud is the only thing that makes it make sense.